Welcome back to the Read and Rant podcast. It's Friday night, and it's time for another segment of the History Unfiltered. And tonight's episode is focusing on the founding fathers unfiltered, the men behind the American myth. All right. So we know the books tell us what happened. The legends do tell us what people remember, but somewhere between the two is the real story. All right. Welcome to History Unfiltered and the Read and Rant podcast.
To the Read It and Rant podcast, where we don't sugarcoat anything, no filters, no holding back, just raw, loud opinions. So turn it up and get ready to rant.
We all know the founding fathers are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. You say those names in America, and you aren't just talking about dead politicians. You're talking about monuments. They're on currency. There's cities named after them, schools named after them. Their faces are carved on Mount Rushmore. Their portraits are hanging in classrooms and museums. Their quotes are carved into stone. They're men who have been transformed over 2.5 centuries into something larger than human beings. They are the founding fathers. But here's the problem. Marble doesn't always argue. Marble doesn't even make mistakes. It doesn't hold contradictory beliefs. It doesn't accumulate debt. It doesn't lose its temper. It doesn't scheme against political rivals. It doesn't even own human beings while talking about liberty and writing about it in the most important document in our nation. And it doesn't change its mind. Human beings change their mind and do all of that. And the men who helped create the United States of America, they were very, very human, They fought the British Empire. They created revolutionary politically charged ideas. They designed institutions that have survived for more than 2 centuries. And they also compromised. And they failed and they feuded and they owned and enslaved people. And they made horrible predictions while holding prejudices and changing positions. And on top of that, they also seemed to despise one another, including Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And today, we're not going to tear down the founding fathers, and we're not going to put halos over their heads either. We're going to do something much more interesting. We're actually going to meet them as human beings and not statues. Because this is the founding fathers unfiltered, the men behind the American myth. All right? Now, before we begin, the Read It Rant podcast has to put a disclaimer out there because we condemn racism, anti-Semitism, racial supremacy, slavery, discrimination, religious hatred, and the dehumanization of any group of people. History Unfiltered discusses disturbing institutions, beliefs, and language because understanding history requires, confronting the historical record rather than hiding from it. And discussing those beliefs does not constitute endorsing them. And this episode isn't designed to convince you that the founding fathers were heroes. And it's also not designed to convince you they were villains. It's designed to demonstrate why both descriptions can become dangerously simplistic when they're allowed to replace evidence. We're going to use original documents alongside scholarship and research from institutions including the National Archives, the Library of Congress, the estate of George Washington at Mount Vernon, the estate of Monticello from Thomas Jefferson, Montpelier's estate from James Madison, the National Constitution Center, and other historical collections. Because if we're going to talk about the men who founded the United States, we should probably let the men speak for themselves, all right? Now, I want to address the question of who were the founding fathers exactly. And that's something that really gets, the question gets interesting because it's very broad. There wasn't some official membership card labeled founding father. The little name tag right here didn't say, hey, I'm a founding father. No. They were a generation of political leaders, soldiers, diplomats, writers, and statesmen who participated in different parts of America's founding. Some signed the Declaration of Independence. Some even fought the Revolutionary War. Some even wrote the Constitution. Some didn't do anything at all. Some even served in the first federal government. Some of them became presidents. And different people get included depending upon how broadly you define that term. Because the National Archives Founders Online Collection gives us the papers of 7 major figures. We got Washington, Franklin, John Adams and his family, Jefferson, Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. That collection now contains more than 184,000 searchable documents. And think about that for a minute, all right? There are more than 184,000 documents, from letters, arguments, debates, drafts, private thoughts, government documents. There's policy debates. There's correspondence between friends and enemies. So whenever somebody tells you the founding fathers believed, your first question shouldn't be, well, what did they believe? You should be asking which ones and what did they believe? Because these men disagreed constantly. And honestly, they didn't even agree about the country they were even building upon, the founding of it. It's one of the biggest myths of the founding. Because we sometimes imagine this Last Supper depiction of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't, excellent. We all agree we're in Philly. Let's have a great time. Let's go get a cheesesteak. Let's sign a document and we're free. No, 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 no. They fought politically over almost everything, like how powerful the federal government should be, how powerful the executive branch and the president should be, how should states be represented, and should representation in Congress be based on population. They argued about states if states should receive equal representation in Congress. They argued how taxes work. Should there be a national bank at the federal level? How much power should the judicial branch and judges possess? How should slavery be handled? What rights needed explicit protection? And what should America's relationship with Britain mean? Now that we just like dismantle their entire military and defeated them on the battlefield? Or even what about France? Who can vote? And they also said how democratic should this republic actually become? And at the Constitutional Convention itself, the disagreements became so severe that three delegates present at the end, George Mason, Edmund Randolph, and Elderidge Gerry, refused to sign the finished Constitution. And one of George Mason's complaints, there was no Bill of Rights. The National Archives confirms that 39 of the 42 delegates present at the signing ultimately signed, while Mason, Gerry, and Randolph refused to sign. Think about that. One of the documents we now treat as almost sacred was controversial from the moment it was created. That is not weakness. That is history. And I don't think people understand that George Washington could have become something much more than our president. At the time, Washington, they wanted him to rule for more than 2 terms. Um, because he was commander of the Continental Army, he was president of the Constitutional Convention, and he was first president of the United States of America. I'm going to address this in a little bit, but term limits weren't amended to the Constitution until after FDR was president. FDR, people don't understand this historically. FDR almost served 4 terms. He died in office before he could serve his 4th term. And the only reason why every president after Washington only served 2 terms was because Washington set the example for the 2 term limit. And every president after him, besides FDR, I think somebody else, served 2 terms because they didn't want to tarnish Washington's example, and they believed it was in poor taste. And because honestly, too, like Washington was probably the closest thing at this time as well that America has to a secular founding saint. But if you strip away that marble, Washington wasn't born knowing he would become George Washington. I mean, granted, he was a planter, a surveyor, an officer. He was ambitious. He was a man that was always concerned with his reputation. Respect meant a great deal to him. Um, I'm gonna be honest though, on the battlefield, he suffered a lot of defeats before he achieved the defeat of Cornwallis, and the entire British Army. But he was eventually going to be a man who was facing an extraordinary amount of political pressure and problems. And I think the most obvious question he always asked himself at first was, how do you become the first president when nobody has ever been president before? Like, he doesn't have a tradition of past presidencies. There's no presidential library. There's no other administration to copy. There's no established understanding of how the office should behave like we have now. You know, Everything is accredited to Washington because he invented these norms in real time. And like I said earlier, one of his most important contributions to the actual office in the executive branch as a president was his example of his 2 term limit. Because after 2 terms, he left. Even though the people begged him to stay, he didn't want the position of the presidency to turn into a dictatorship and a monarchy like they just left in England, like they just rebelled over. And honestly, there's a difference between monarchy and socialism and communism. And I think people don't understand, like, yes, the Federalist documents were written to prevent us to go back to a monarchy at that time, but that was a dictatorship and a monarchy at that point in time was all the rules of government that were established at that point. Communism and socialism are a more modern form of government. That's why you're seeing they they wrote the Constitution with the monarchy, the anti-monarchy rhetoric in the Federalist Papers. They didn't have the communist and socialist Karl Marx to go off of, to actually model the Constitution after, or I guess model it. So they didn't. if I think if history would have been a lot different if those two forms of government around. But anyway, I'm digressing. Um, and also, Washington didn't want the presidency to become a lifetime position, which I think to him it mattered enormously. But I also think that people don't history and people don't know that Washington's story has a whole nother side. A side that Americans are ignorant of and have honestly ignored for generations. And it's crazy that the first one of the first signers to sign the Constitution, when that's signed his name under a law that said all men are created equally. At the same time, Washington was a slaveholder. Because if you look at Mount Vernon's own historians document how they document slavery as an integral part of Washington's life from childhood, he inherited enslaved people when he was young. He purchased enslaved people. He gained control over many others through marriage. And by 1799, there were 317 enslaved people living in Mount Vernon. Although Washington did not legally own every one of them because many belonged to his wife and the Custis estate connected to her, which is Martha Washington, and that distinction really matters legally. Um, but you have to really imagine life from the perspective of somebody enslaved there. You have a guy that just fought to free the land from British monarch and tyranny while writing all men are created equal, but you're still in bondage and enslaved at Mount Vernon. You know, and you have to also think about whether Washington technically owned your legal title or controlled you through the Custis estate. It didn't change the fundamental fact, even though it's being written in the First Continental Congress that all men are created equal. But the people in bondage still weren't free. Because Mount Vernon estimates that at least 577 enslaved people lived and worked there over the course of Washington's lifetime. The man who became the symbol of American liberty therefore spent his life economically and personally entangled with human bondage. It's uncomfortable, as it should be, but Washington's story doesn't stop there either. His thinking about slavery changed courses during the course of his life. And in his will, Washington provided that the enslaved people he personally owned would eventually be emancipated and freed. However, Mount Vernon explains that roughly 120 people Washington owned outright were ultimately freed under the provisions of his will. However, enslaved people belonging to the Custis estate would not be freed by Washington's will because they were owned by the Custis estate and Martha Washington. And those enslaved people that weren't freed through Washington's will were dispersed among Washington's descendants, meaning their children and grandchildren. So what do we do with Washington with these facts? Do we call him a champion of liberty, even though he was? Do we call him a slaveholder because he was? Say his views evolved? They did. Or should we say he went far enough? Because I don't think he did. Especially if you're one of the human beings who spent decades enslaved at Mount Vernon. And I think history requires holding all those cards at once. But then there's somebody else. And there's somebody else who we really need to stop treating history like mythology, um, especially when we're looking through the eyes of Oneida Judge. Especially when we look at Washington as the father of this country, um, and then you look at if you're on the Mount Vernon estate and you're a slave by the name of Oneida Judge, you have to look through her eyes and, really introspect to somebody who wanted freedom from George Washington. I think through her eyes, she wanted freedom from him, and she's watching this dude in Congress write all men are created equal. You know? However, she was still enslaved within Washington's household. And even after he became president, enslaved people worked inside the presidential household itself in Philadelphia. If you don't believe me, go to the National Park Service President's House site in Philly and intentionally explores this contradiction. The nation's first presidency operated in literal shadow of Independence Hall, while enslaved people lived and labored within the president's household. That's America in miniature. There's liberty upstairs, slavery downstairs. A republic proclaiming natural rights, while some of the people serving as presidents possessed no legal freedom themselves. History doesn't get much more unfiltered than that. And I think we have to go to somebody else who signed the Declaration and another founding father. And that's Thomas Jefferson. He's America's walking contradiction. Because if Washington's complicated, Jefferson is the walking definition of contradiction. Jefferson writes, all men are created equal. Those words echo throughout the pages of history. They will be cited by abolitionists and civil rights leaders in the 60s, and reformers and presidents alike, and revolutionaries around the world. while Monticello describes Jefferson's declaration as articulating principles of liberty and equality that became central to this nation's aspirations, but Jefferson himself enslaved more than 610 human beings over the course of his life. That is twice as many as Washington. The man who wrote one of history's greatest statements about human equality enslaved more than 600 people while writing that notion. If you wanted a single historical figure to demonstrate why History Unfiltered exists, Thomas Jefferson is your man. He is a walking contradiction. Even though, and on top of that, Jefferson knew slavery was wrong. And that's what makes him even more complicated. He didn't simply live inside a slave society while never questioning slavery. He criticized it, he called it immoral, he described it as a threat to the Republic, and Monticello even notes that Jefferson called slavery a moral depravity and a hideous blot on the pages of history, while simultaneously profiting from enslaved labor throughout his entire life. So he understood there was a contradiction. He never even solved it. And I think that's incredibly significant because sometimes people defend historical figures by saying you can't judge them. Everybody thought that way back then. No, but not everybody thought that way. So when somebody says that the North, didn't have slavery or, you can't judge these people, everybody thought that way back then. They didn't. There were anti slavery arguments. Enslaved people obviously understood the injustice of their conditions. Free black Americans spoke against slavery. Even Quakers here in Pennsylvania challenged it. There were abolition movements that developed long before the 1860s. And Jefferson himself acknowledged slavery's a moral problem. So historical context is essential, but context is not a magic eraser either. And I think something else is even more fascinating. Jefferson didn't claim he invented every principle in the Declaration of Independence. Years later, writing about his origins in his memoirs, Jefferson explained the Declaration was intended as an expression of what he called the American mind, rather than an entirely original philosophical creation. That's extremely important. Jefferson synthesized ideas, natural rights, English political traditions, Enlightenment philosophy, colonial grievances, revolutionary rhetoric, and then he gave those ideas language powerful enough to survive centuries. That is genius, but here's another uncomfortable piece of that. Jefferson's rough draft included an attack involving slavery and the slave trade that was removed before the final declaration was adopted. Monticello's examination of the Declaration notes that the slavery-related language was removed amid the effort to secure agreement among the colonies. And there it is again. They had to compromise because of the other colonies wouldn't have been in agreement to sign it if that provision wasn't taken out. Now, the founding generation's greatest achievements repeatedly collide with its greatest unresolved contradiction. And I think Jefferson's revolution was bigger than Jefferson himself. And that's perhaps the greatest historical irony surrounding him. Jefferson could literally write words that were more radical than Jefferson himself was prepared to live out and walk his talk. All men are created equal. And once those words existed, Jefferson doesn't get exclusive ownership of what they mean. Later generations can look at those and say, then abolish slavery, extend citizenship, extend universal enfranchisement, extend voting rights, dismantle legal segregation, and apply equal protection. That principle seriously outgrew that man, and he didn't do anything about establishing those principles during his lifetime. That's why studying Jefferson requires more than either Jefferson was a hero or Jefferson was a hypocrite. He was capable of being historically transformative and morally contradictory at the exact same time. And I think everybody gets so lost with Washington, Hamilton, John Jay. People forget about John Adams. Poor John Adams. If American history was a freaking family photograph, Adams would probably complain that everyone keeps cropping him out. Washington gets Mount Rushmore as Jefferson. Franklin gets the damn $100 bill. Hamilton gets Broadway. Adams gets an excellent HBO miniseries. But Adams was enormously important. He was a revolutionary advocate. He was a diplomat. He was vice president. He was second president. He was he had serious political discourse enough to encourage him to be a very concise debater when it came to politics. And even as an orator. And unlike Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, one thing about John Adams I don't think people understand, John Adams never owned enslaved people. The National Park Service specifically contrasts Washington's enslaved presidential household in Philadelphia with the smaller household of John Adams, noting that Adams never owned slaves. And I want to push pause here for a minute because I forgot something I said in the last episode. Um, Paul Revere, during the Revolutionary War, didn't make that midnight ride that alerted the British were coming. The only reason the title of that he became historically known to make the Midnight Ride is because of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere that was actually penned by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The one that actually made the ride to warn the British were coming, his name was Israel Bissell. Um, and the reason why he's not historically linked to that account is because Israel Bissell sounds like a Jewish vacuum cleaner. And I'm not anti-Semitic. That's just a joke. Don't cancel me. But you know, that's another historical myth that they don't teach you in school. Another history unfiltered fun fact. Anyway, you know, getting back to John Adams. John Adams was not morally perfect either. He wasn't. And that also demonstrates something crucial though. Again, because the founders were not interchangeable. Yes, they made different choices, but it still doesn't change the fact that they weren't interchangeable. Um and I think Adams, was one of America's earliest political stress tests with a change of power. Especially with the election of 1800. There was a book I have called The Tumultuous Election of 1800 between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. It was seriously personal, it was partisan, it was bitter, it was brutal. Jefferson defeated Adams and power ultimately transferred from one political faction to another. But I mean, think about how extraordinary that is. This is an experiment in Republican government. It's brand new. Political enemies believed the other side might destroy the country. And yet the government changed hands. There wasn't hereditary succession. There wasn't permanent presidency. There was no king and no civil war over the election. That doesn't make Adams and Jefferson best friends in that moment. That was far freaking from it. They actually hated one another, despised one another, but the system survived. And eventually something wonderful did happen. Adams and Jefferson later in life began corresponding again. They were two old revolutionaries, two former presidents, two political enemies. They were writing back and forth as elderly men about history, religion, politics, philosophy, and mortality. And then July 4th, 1826, exactly to the day, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, both men died on the same day. You couldn't write that in the notebook in a screenplay without somebody saying that's way too obvious. History did it anyway. It's one of the beautiful penmanship of history. Um, and then we have Benjamin Franklin. Oh, Benjamin Franklin, the original American celebrity. He was a printer, a writer, a scientist, Silence Dogood, um, an inventor, a diplomat, a political operator. He was a postmaster, a satirist, and possibly the most interesting guy at any 18th century dinner table. That guy wrote some weird stuff. But the National Archives describes Franklin's extraordinary list of careers: printer, writer, inventor, scientist, lawmaker, diplomat, and postmaster. Honestly, he helped draft the Declaration of Independence, and he's also somebody we can credit for the invention of bifocals, the lightning rod, um, also daylight savings time, the original thought of the light bulb. I think I think don't quote me on that. I'm going to look that up, but he participated in the Constitutional Convention. He served as America's diplomat in France. He helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War. And he wasn't simply a politician; he was a brand. Before America actually knew what America was, Benjamin Franklin was honestly helping create an image of American identity. He was practically self-made. He was irreverent and curious and inventive. Um, his story involving slavery is another example of change over time, though. He had connections to slavery early in his life, but later in life, he became an outspoken abolitionist and opponent to slavery. By 1790, Franklin served as president of the Pennsylvania Society promoting the abolition of slavery. Like I said, the abolition movement started way before 1860, and you can see Benjamin Franklin leading the charge in 1790. And one of the final major public acts of his life was submitting an abolition petition to Congress. And the National Archives preserved that petition. It called upon Congress to address slavery and the slave trade and asked the government to confront what the petition described as an inconsistency in America's national character. Think about that timing. 1790. The Constitution has barely gone into operation. George Washington is president, and Benjamin Franklin is asking the new federal government to confront slavery. And the Southern representatives reacted angrily because the South's economy depended on slavery. Congress debated it, and then about only 2 months later, Franklin died. The founding generation was already arguing about slavery almost immediately after creating the new federal government because you can't write all men are created equal. And then all of a sudden you have people in bondage that aren't equal to you. You know, and I think people said that, slavery was, the Civil War was only fought over slavery. I covered that on their podcast. But here in 1790, you have Ben Franklin introducing, documents to Congress of his serious opposition to slavery. You know, that unresolved contradiction was there from the very beginning, you know? And then let's put Alexander Hamilton in this mix. He was the founder who wanted more government because Alexander Hamilton was an immigrant. He was a revolutionary officer. He was Washington's aide de camp. He was Constitution advocate. He was a Federalist Papers author. He was Alexander Hamilton is where we get like the Federalist Papers were written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. They were literally the document that explained the Constitution and why they put so many checks and balances in place because John and James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton studied governments of the world from Britain to Rome, and they took pieces of it and basically made the Constitution. And that's why there's so many checks and balances that they wanted to prevent the tyrannical monarchical rule from England from overtaking America. Um, Hamilton was also Secretary of the Treasury, and yes, the guy from the freaking musical. But forget Broadway for a minute, all right? Hamilton represents one of the founding generation's biggest arguments. How powerful should the federal government be? Hamilton believed the United States required effective national power. And I like to say this too. When the Federalist Papers were written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, they didn't have socialism and communism forms of government at the time. They only had the monarchy. So there's three different forms of government, and the only thing they based the Federalist Papers off of was monarchy. All right, you know, Hamilton was asking questions about public credit, about financial stability, federal institutions, a capable executive of strong national economy. His opponents really saw danger with all these questions, and they were, Congress was getting nervous. And Jefferson and others feel that Hamilton's vision could create concentrated financial and political power that looks suspiciously similar to the European systems America has supposedly rejected. And that's where America's party politics start getting vicious. Um, Hamilton versus Jefferson wasn't necessarily personality. It was competing visions of America's future. Um, and then if you look at Hamilton's historical relationship with slavery too, that's complicated, and it should be discussed carefully instead of it turning into an either pro Hamilton or anti Hamilton mythology into fact. What we can document clearly is that Hamilton participated in New York's anti-slavery movement. Founders Online records Hamilton as a member of the New York Manumission Society. In 1786, Hamilton and others signed a petition urging New York lawmakers to end the slave trade, describing it as inconsistent with a free and enlightened society. Hamilton therefore belonged to an organized effort challenging slavery and the slave trade. I think that really deserves some recognition, especially with Jefferson and Washington. But here is the History Unfiltered warning. Don't turn that into Hamilton single handedly fought slavery while every other founder supported it. That's mythology too. The Manumission Society itself contained complicated membership, including some members who held enslaved people. Its own debates had to confront that contradiction. History really refuses to cooperate with our desire for clean teams. Um, However, like I said before, Hamilton's greatest legacies is in his role defending the Constitution through the Federalist Papers. He organized the dang project. Him and James Madison wrote most of the 85 essays. John Jay also wrote several others. I gave him credit where credit's due. These essays were designed to persuade Americans, particularly New Yorkers, to ratify the Constitution. The National Constitution Center describes them as among the most important early explanations of the Constitution and its system of government. But here's the fascinating part. Hamilton and Madison were allies when selling the Constitution. Later, they became political enemies. Think about that for a minute, too. Two guys can cooperate to create and defend a political system. Then they can violently disagree about how that system should actually operate. Like, that's American politics in a nutshell. Apparently, we've been doing this since the damn beginning. Now, there were different parties back then, but we'll get to that later. All right? Um, and then we have James Madison. He was literally the father of the Constitution. Small physically, but intellectually, he was enormous. Um, he spent enormous amounts of time studying governments, ancient republics, European confederations, political failures, human nature, and he arrives in Philly like prepared. He got a cheesesteak in one hand and a quill in the other. No, I'm just kidding. But Montpelier describes him as one of the most important architects of the Constitution and later the Bill of Rights. And one of Madison's biggest concerns was faction. Um, Groups of citizens really, pursuing interests that might threaten the rights of others or the long term interest of the republic. His famous Federalist Number 10 tackles that problem. And rather than believing human beings would suddenly become perfect citizens, Madison designed the Federalist Papers and the Constitution around imperfection. That is one of the founders' most interesting characteristics. They talked about liberty, virtue, republican government, but many of them also deeply distrusted what human beings might do with power. So they literally created separate branches of government, checks, balances, competing institutions, federalism, elections at different intervals, and a system where, in theory, ambition could check ambition and ambition could check more ambition. The Constitution was not designed for angels. It was designed because they were seriously cynical, and they knew that people are not angels. However, History Unfiltered, we have slavery because that was Madison's biggest contradiction as well. He enslaved human beings. Montpelier itself openly acknowledges that Madison's political career and family wealth were supported by the institution of enslaved people and enslaved labor on his plantation. Across generations, more than 300 African Americans were enslaved in bondage at Montpelier under the Madison family. So here's Madison. He was an architect of Republican government, defender of individual liberty, father of the Constitution, and once again, he was a slaveholder, while being the father of a document that said all men are created equal. And again, this contradiction isn't a footnote. It is a part of the story. And I think we should all talk about the elephant in the room in Philadelphia. Slavery nearly tore apart political negotiations from America's early years. The Constitution did not contain the word slavery explicitly in its original text, but provisions were written around that specific institution. The compromises affected representation with federal power, the international slave trade, fugitive enslaved peoples. The infamous Three-Fifths Clause counted three-fifths of the enslaved population's purposes, including representation and direct taxation. But here's something that people seriously misunderstand. This clause did not mean the Constitution was philosophically declaring an enslaved person to be three-fifths human. Enslaved people at that time possessed essentially no political representation themselves. That formula instead increased the political representation of states holding large enslaved populations by partially counting people who could not vote and were treated as property under state law. So the morally ugly question in Philadelphia was how human is an enslaved person. It was how much political power will slaveholding states receive because of the people that they enslave. That is arguably even more revealing. And I think one of the hardest things to confront about the Constitution as well is compromise made agreement possible. Without compromise, we may not have a Constitution or haven't even been ratified. And it also left an enormous moral and political conflict unresolved, especially with slavery. The founders created mechanisms capable of governing disagreement, but they did not solve every disagreement. And some compromises delayed conflict. And sometimes delaying conflict doesn't eliminate it. Sometimes it gives the conflict 70 years to grow. Episode 1 of History Unfiltered show where that eventually led, which was the American Civil War, among other things. This is why the American founding and Civil War stories cannot really be separated. The seeds of 1861 were already present in the founding of this nation in the documents that were ratified in this and signed in this nation in 1787. And I think we need to talk about George Mason. He was the founder who said no. Because I don't think George Mason gets Washington level attention a lot. Mason helped produce Virginia's Declaration of Rights. He became one of the Constitutional Convention's most active delegates. And then he refused to sign the Constitution. Why? Because there were no Bill of Rights. And that was his biggest objection. There was too much potential power in parts of the federal government. Mason had concerns about representation, about the judicial branch of government, and he had concerns that the new government could become aristocratic. The National Constitution Center preserves Mason's objections and notes that his arguments become influential in anti-federalist opposition during ratification. Like, imagine that, okay? Today we might be criticizing the Constitution as somehow un-American. One of the founders literally refused to sign it because he thought it didn't protect liberty enough. However, George Mason's refusal and his opposition to sign helped create political pressure for the Bill of Rights that we know now. If that dissent didn't happen, how if it our American founding tradition wouldn't happen if George Mason would have just signed the Declaration of Independence. That dissent helped create the Bill of Rights, you know? And the Bill of Rights wasn't, created immediately. That's a serious misconception. The Constitution wasn't signed with an attachment with the Bill of Rights. The original Constitution emerged from Philly without one, and actually, historically, we were out without the Constitution for a period of years. We were still under the Articles of Confederation and Jim Crow laws in the South. It became one of the biggest objections that was raised by anti-federalists. You know, when the Constitution was drafted, they basically said, "Why doesn't this new federal government explicitly guarantee freedom of speech or religion, or press, or due process, jury protections, protection against unreasonable search and seizure?" Supporters of the Constitution argued about whether an enumeration was necessary. These opponents really kept pushing back. Eventually, James Madison took the lead in proposing amendments. And then the first 10 amendments of the Constitution became what we now call the Bill of Rights. So one of the most celebrated pieces of America's constitutional structure exists partly because people looked at the founders' work and really originally said that isn't good enough. It's beautiful, but American government was being revised before the ink was even dry on the piece of parchment. And I think the biggest thing I think they could agree on, the founders were afraid of going back to a tyrannical state of government. It's a theme that is honestly tying all these men together. Their fear of concentrated power. But they didn't always agree where the greatest danger came from. Was it Congress, a president, a king, state and local governments, judges, a judicial branch, a standing army, a wealthy elite, a democratic majority, a violent mob, a faction? They worried about all that. That's why the Constitution looks the way it does today. It is a machine literally built from a cynical, distrustful nature of the politicians that helped draft the Constitution at its inception. There was power divided against power. There needs to be institutions checking institutions, state versus federal government, House versus Senate, Congress versus president, courts versus legislation, elections happening on different schedules. They didn't really at that time knew everybody was going to agree because they didn't agree. They were conflicted. They expected conflict because they were experiencing it even when the Constitution was even before the ink was even put on the piece of animal skin when it was being signed. They wanted a system designed capable of surviving the conflict and disagreement and the partisan politics. And I think the other thing is they didn't create a modern democracy either. That kind of vocabulary is confusing, and it shouldn't have a place in this discourse. The early United States wasn't a democracy in the modern universal suffrage sense. Voting rules varied by states, and we'll get to the Southern voting rules when it came to the Reconstruction Amendments at a later podcast. Property requirements existed in various places. Women generally couldn't vote. They couldn't vote. Enslaved people couldn't vote. They weren't even enfranchised at this point yet. Native Americans were genuinely outside the political system being constructed by the new federal government. Free black voting rights varied and became subject to restriction in many places. Senators weren't originally elected directly by voters. The president wasn't even chosen through a national popular vote. The founders talked over and over about Republican government, but many were weary of unchecked direct democracy. So when we look backward and say they created democracy, that's broadly understandable but historically inaccurate. They created a constitutional republic whose democratic participation expanded dramatically over later generations. And people fought, and sometimes literally, and got into duels and died to expand who counted as we the people. However, the founders weren't politically united for very long, and I think this is where the story almost becomes funny. And Washington famously worried about political factions. And what happened? His own administration basically incubated America's first party system. Hamilton leads one vision. Jefferson and Madison organized opposition. Newspapers viciously attacked politicians. Anonymous essays fly around. There was accusations of monarchism. There were accusations of radicalism, corruption, and that political opponents would destroy the republic. Sound familiar? Modern Americans sometimes say politics becomes so nasty. And let me tell you, my friends, I need to tell you something, all right? Go read politics in the 1790s. Read the conflict with Aaron Burr. America didn't lose some magical golden age in which politicians politely disagreed over some tea and crumpets. The founding fathers are freaking savage. And speaking of savage politics, Alexander Hamilton gave us one of the strangest political self defense strategies in American history in the Reynolds affair. Hamilton was accused of financial corruption involving James Reynolds. And what was Hamilton's response? He published an enormous explanation demonstrating that he wasn't financially corrupt because the suspicious payments were connected to an extramarital affair with Reynolds' wife Maria. Essentially, I didn't commit this scandal. I committed this scandal, like a Bill Clinton situation. You know, Hamilton published what became known as the Reynolds pamphlet. And on to further that narrative, the National Archives Founders Online Collection preserves his writings from the episode as part of the Hamilton Papers. So yes, one of America's greatest political minds publicly detonated his own personal reputation in an effort to defend his public financial integrity. He was a founding father, treasury genius, revolutionary veteran, an absolute chaos machine. But he was also a human being, you know? And then he gets shot. It ends dramatically, as his life might suggest. His political rival Aaron Burr. They had a duel in Weehawken, New Jersey, July 1804. Um, they had a political and personal dispute, and it led to a violent honor culture that seems almost incomprehensible today. Hamilton is mortally wounded. He dies the next day. And I love when I hear that politics has become so nasty. I'm like, look, 1790s politics is different than today. Today is mild. Like Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton over political and personal differences. You know, the for and even imagine explaining that modern political dispute. You know, the former Treasury Secretary and sitting Vice President met across the river and shot at each other. America was young. The institutions were very experimental and the politicians were human, sometimes dangerously human, you know? I just think it's crazy that people today say that, politics is so nasty and it's mudslinging. I'm like, dude, these people literally were so mad at each other, they wanted to kill each other. That is freaking savage on the face of it. And I think another thing we should do on top of that is stop pretending the founders possessed supernatural knowledge of the future. They didn't know what America would become. They couldn't envision nuclear weapons, communism, the internet, socialism, modern surveillance, artificial intelligence, mass media, modern political parties, the Democrats, Republicans, the DSA, or whatever, or a population of hundreds of millions, or that America will become a global military superpower. They designed governments for problems they understood in the day that they lived in, using political theory available to them at that time to draft the Federalist Papers in the government that they knew at that time, while also trying to build institutions flexible enough to survive problems they couldn't predict. Sometimes they succeeded brilliantly, and sometimes they failed. And they knew future generations would have to, modify what they created. That is why there is an amendment process. The Constitution wasn't written as the final document. It didn't say nobody touch this ever. It contains a mechanism for change. Um, so I think we have to really ask, why did we turn these guys into marble statues? And I think it's because nations tell stories about themselves. Every country does. Founding stories create identity. Heroes do become symbols, but those symbols become simplified. And Washington becomes honesty. Jefferson becomes the face of liberty. Washington or Franklin becomes the face of ingenuity. Hamilton gets his literal face put on a damn bill, and then he also becomes finance. Madison gets his face slapped on the Federalist Papers. Becomes the Constitution. Adams becomes independence, and eventually the person disappears behind the symbol, which is understandable. But history suffers when symbolism replaces biography, because once Washington becomes purely virtuous, you lose his struggles with slavery, and then once Jefferson becomes simply the author of liberty, you lose Monticello, and then once Franklin becomes a lovable inventor, you lose his whole political evolution and who he was beyond that. And once Madison becomes simply the father of the Constitution, you lose the plantation supporting his intellectual life. And once you respond by saying, fine, they were all monsters, you lose their genuine accomplishments as well. You're still flattening history. You simply just flip the statue upside down. But also, you can't say that, if you worship history, it's bad. It's bad. Demonization can be bad too. We can't reduce Washington entirely to slaveholding. We lose the revolutionary commander who surrendered military authority and helped establish peaceful republican precedents. If we reduce Jefferson entirely to hypocrisy, we lose the enormous historical power of the Declaration's natural rights language. And on top of that, if we reduce Madison to entirely to plantation slavery, we lose one of history's most influential exercises in constitutional design. Now, I'm not saying that slavery is amazing. I'm saying that you can't. It should have been dealt with in 1787 and 1790. It should have been done away with. But you can't take away from what these men created to help, you know, give birth to what we live in now. Um, and if we reduce Franklin entirely to his early participation in a slave society, we lose the man who ended his life petitioning the federal government against slavery. Historical criticism should reveal complexity, not destroy it. The goal isn't to love them or hate them, it is to understand them. You know, and now I need to, really turn the camera around here on History Unfiltered because calling a handful of elite white political leaders the founders can accidentally make everyone else disappear. Who else built this entire country? There are soldiers, farmers, craftsmen. There are women maintaining households and political networks. There are enslaved laborers, black soldiers, free black communities, nations negotiating, resisting, and fighting. There are immigrants, printers, sailors, merchants, ordinary people. The elite statesmen who wrote constitutions at the state level. Human beings whose names we never even know built the roads, harvested the crops, carried military supplies, worked plantations, operated households, and created the economic world that made elite political careers possible. Montpelier itself describes enslaved people whose labor supported Madison's ability to pursue public life as essentially as invisible participants in the nation's founding story. That is a powerful phrase. That something good came from slavery, and it sucks to say that, and it's bad, but we wouldn't be here without that concept, you know, because America's founding wasn't just formed by seven guys standing around a parchment; it was a team effort. Um, And I want to also give credit where the evidence supports it. They helped achieve independence from one of the world's greatest empires. Like, they developed a durable, written constitutional system. They created mechanisms for transferring political power without hereditary monarchy. They constructed a federal republic balancing national and state authority. They produced a Bill of Rights. They developed institutions capable of surviving, intense political disagreement. They articulated natural rights language whose influence expanded far beyond the limited society that originally produced it. And the Constitution they helped create remains in operation more than 250 years later. It is historically extraordinary. You don't have to pretend these men were perfect to recognize that. In fact, their achievements may be even more impressive when you realize they weren't supernatural geniuses descended from the heavens. They were people. They were people arguing in hot rooms and hot wigs. They got things wrong. They did compromise. They even friggin' panicked. But they were people that were protecting they were federal and state interests. They were also worried about the whole experience might collapse. All the time, mind you. But somehow they produced something that survived them twice over. But I think we also need to talk about their failures. They really, really failed to abolish slavery. They failed to create universal political equality when the document they wrote and they signed prohibited it because they said all are created equal. And they failed to resolve native sovereignty and settler expansion justly. They failed to include women fully within political citizenship. They failed to prevent faction despite worrying about it constantly. And they failed to settle the ultimate boundary between federal and state authority. And they left later Americans gigantic unresolved questions. Who qualifies as a citizen? Who can vote? What does equality really mean? How powerful can the federal government become? What rights can never be violated? How far does executive authority extend? And what happens when states reject federal authority? And what happens when majority rule threatens minority rights and rules? And those aren't obscure historical questions. And even today, we're still arguing about variations of them. Um, but maybe the founders' greatest legacy isn't that they gave America every answer because they did. Maybe it's that they built an arena in which Americans can continue arguing about the answers. You know, we have a constitution, we have amendments and elections and courts, legislators, federalism, political speech, peaceful transfers of power, mechanism for change. They really created something unfinished, and every generation inherited it. That might actually be more interesting than believing a group of 18th century men solved government forever. Um, so I want to take a look back. Who were the founding fathers? Were they heroes? Sometimes they were hypocrites. Absolutely, they were geniuses. Some of them unquestionably possessed extraordinary political and intellectual ability. They were deeply flawed. Some of them were slaveholders, but some also opposed slavery later in life. And I think some did change their positions in later in life. They did not agree with one another, not even close. Um, they didn't create America exactly as exists today. They didn't, they honestly created the building blocks and foundations of the political system that would go through change after change, with the generations of Americans that came after them. It continuously changed. Washington wasn't marble and Hamilton wasn't a musical. Madison wasn't simply the Constitution. Adams wasn't just a guy between Washington and Jefferson. They were human beings. They were brilliant, ambitious, contradictory, frustrating, visionary, self interest. They were courageous, prejudiced, idealistic, political, and sometimes completely fucking chaotic. In other words, they were people. And perhaps the most important thing we can learn about them, because when we transform history into mythology, we make its achievements impossible to understand. Because if Washington was destined to win, there's nothing to learn from his failures. And if Jefferson was born knowing exactly what liberty meant, there's nothing to learn from his contradictions. And if Madison effortlessly created the Constitution, there's nothing to learn from the compromises and arguments that produced it. And if Franklin was always enlightened, there's nothing to learn from how his views changed. And if America was destined to succeed, there's nothing to learn from how close the experiment repeatedly came to failure. History becomes meaningful when the outcome isn't inevitable. These men didn't know they were going to become statues. They didn't know their faces would appear on money. They didn't know children would memorize their names. They didn't know buildings would carry them. They didn't even know Broadway would turn into one of their arguments into rap lyrics. They were simply standing inside their own present, trying to figure out what came next. Sometimes it was courageously, sometimes it was selfish. Other times it was seriously brilliant, other times it was disastrous. And that's why History Unfiltered doesn't need to destroy the founding fathers. I just want to remove the marble. Let Washington be Washington. Let Jefferson be Jefferson. Let Adams argue. Let Hamilton scheme. Let Madison analyze. Let Franklin evolve. And let Mason dissent. And let the people they enslaved, governed, fought beside, and disagreed with, and depended upon finally enter the story too. Because understanding America's founding doesn't require choosing between the founders were perfect and the founders were evil. There's an entire historical world between these two sentences, and that's where we're going to live. Because the books tell us what happened, the legends tell us what people remember, but somewhere between the two is the real story, This has been the Read It Rant Podcast presents History Unfiltered, Episode 3, The Founding Fathers Unfiltered, The Men Behind the American Myth. You got to read the letters, the drafts, the arguments, the people who disagree with them, the stories of the people whose names never made the monuments. You need to question the mythology, but don't replace it with another mythology. You need to follow the evidence wherever it goes. And until next time, stay tuned for Episode 4, The Constitution Unfiltered, the deals, arguments, and compromises that built America. And until next time, embrace the rant. Read it and rant is out.